Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening for our September Livable Future Live event. Tonight we are really excited to be having a conversation with Tom Philpott about his recent book, Perilous Bounty, which talks about the challenges that we currently face in our farm system and some of the solutions that we're working toward. So I'm going to give people just another minute to get logged in. And in the meantime, I just have a couple of quick reminders and upcoming event announcements that I'll share with you all. And while I'm doing that, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. You can share your name and where you're joining us from today. So just to get us started with a couple quick Zoom reminders, if you want to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, just click on the Show Captions button that you see in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. And please feel free to continue to use the chat box during the event as a space to share your thoughts and have a conversation with the fellow attendees here tonight. And we will have some time for Q&A with Tom at the end. So if you have questions as you're listening to the conversation, please just go ahead and add those to the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on those as those come in. And finally, we are recording today's event, so I'll be sharing that later this week, along with any of the links that we are sharing in the chat today. So just to start us off, for those who might be new to Food and Water Watch, just a little bit of background on who we are. We are a national organization fighting for sustainable food, clean water, and a livable climate for all of us. And we do this by mobilizing grassroots activists to build political power at all levels of government. So we're working on federal legislation that would bring sweeping change to food, water, and climate policy. And we also have organizers working on the ground in states across the country on issues that are impacting local communities, including fighting factory farms. And it's really all of you, our members, who make that work possible. We don't take any corporate funding. We are entirely a grassroots movement. So becoming a member of Food and Water Watch truly does make a difference in this work. If you'd like to make a gift and become a member, you can text the word gift to the number 23321 or click on the link that we'll put in the chat for you. And many of you join us for a number of the events in this series called Livable Future Live. This is an opportunity for us to come together as a community to learn more about current events, our organizing campaigns, and hear from leading experts on these issues. So I invite you to join us at some of the upcoming events we have over the next few months. In November, we'll be discussing PFAS, the dangerous forever chemicals that are contaminating our drinking water, and what we're doing about that. And in December, as we close out the year, we're hosting a State of the Union for our food, water, and climate to assess the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we go into a very important election year. And you might notice that we are taking a break from Livable Future Live in October, but that's because we are hosting a very special event called Against All Odds. This is our annual benefit to protect our planet. And this year we're hosting a virtual conference on October 11th and a reception in New York City on October 12th. So you can join us online, in person, or both. And we've got a really exciting speaker lineup for the virtual conference, including actor and activist Jane Fonda, two incredible youth activists, Elise Joshi and Vic Barrett. They'll all be speaking at our opening keynote session. And then we'll also have a number of sessions at the conference, including one on climate anxiety, led by expert Sarah Jaquette Ray, who will be sharing advice from her book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And we'll also be hosting a session discussing the 2024 political landscape and what lies ahead for climate activism. It'll be a great event. I hope that you'll join us. And as a thank you for joining us here this evening, I have a special discount code for you to use to register to sign up for this event. So you can use the code FUTURE to save 20% on Ally and Defender tickets. And we'll put that information in the chat for you, and that code will be valid through this Friday. So be sure to sign up this week. All right, so let's get started with today's topic. First, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Rebecca Wolf. She is Food and Water Watch's Senior Food Policy Analyst, and she works with our allies in Congress to build support for legislation that will reshape our food and farm policy for the better. Some of you here this evening may have attended our Summer in the Weeds series that Rebecca led, diving deeper into the Farm Bill. She's going to be interviewing our guest and expert this evening about his book. So with that, please join me in welcoming Tom Philpott. He is the Senior Research Associate at the Center for a Livable Future and the former Food and Agriculture Correspondent for Mother Jones. And he's the author of the book, Perilous Bounty, The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It, which we'll be discussing tonight. So welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Of course. Rebecca, I'm going to hand things over to you now, but I will be back near the end, where, as I mentioned, we're saving some time for audience Q&A. So as you're listening, if you have questions for Tom, put those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end of this conversation. So thanks, and I'll let you both take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the intros. And thanks for the warm welcome. You know, I was just really excited seeing all the events we have coming up and a lot of the work that we've done over the summer, particularly with our folks getting excited about the Farm Bill, talking about food policy. Folks really got in the weeds as well. That was the name of the series, but really we've got some wonderful volunteers and people who are becoming their own experts in their own right around food policy. So I'm excited to have them with you here today. Someone who I've been following your investigative journalism for a really long time. And I have to say, I really enjoyed reading your book and getting into the weeds on kind of the way that the ecological kind of landscape of our country has also really informed how industrial agriculture is now changing that landscape. So I'm really excited to kind of get into that and get into some of the questions. We've tried to construct the conversation today to go through different pieces of your book and then, be able to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill as we have a deadline approaching at the end of September to get this next one passed. And then get into some audience questions as well. So I wanted to start, Tom, in your book, you mention different stories and research that focus on two very specific regions. We have the Midwest and Iowa around meat production, and we have California and the Central Valley as two major places where agriculture happens in this country. Can you characterize why you decided to kind of frame the book that way and go through those two regions for our audience?
Sure. And I first have to say that, when I started writing about this stuff in probably 2004, 2005, I quickly became aware of Food and Water Watch and have been reading the reports of the organization ever since. I've written a lot of articles about your reports, just sort of, moving your kind of work into the journalistic space and getting more people to read it. So I'm just, I've learned so much from it. So I'm, was delighted to accept this invitation. So, the book does focus on California, really the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is the southern half of the Central Valley, and the Corn Belt are the two main focuses. And I think that, when I started writing nationally about the US food system, you really have to focus on those areas. You find yourself focusing on those areas more and more because they're the dominant sources, the dominant sort of nodes of food production. And they're two dominant nodes in the global food supply chain. These are really, really, really important places. And really the germ of the book kind of came to me in the spring of 2013. And so in that, I'm already covering, there's this drought developing in California, this historic drought is developing in California. And it's causing farmers there in the San Joaquin Valley, which is where a huge amount of fruits and vegetables and nuts and also dairy, a huge producer of dairy. And farmers there are responding to this drought by, there's this well drilling boom. They're just like well drillers can't keep up with the demand for drilling new wells. And they're just sucking groundwater, water from underground at this alarming pace. And I'm just watching this going, we're seeing the extraction happen to the point of literal subsidence. So it's coming out so fast that the land is sinking in some places by several inches per month in this area. And it's causing all these problems. And I found it very startling, and I knew that I was going to be writing about it. And then just at that very time, there were these massive storms hitting the Corn Belt, and I just sort of as part of my job, not only do I have my nose in Food and Water Watch reports, but I'm also reading the farm press. I'm also really following the sort of trade press that covers big ag. And I'm looking at I'm sort of aware of these storms causing problems during the planting season on the Corn Belt. And there was an article in the farm press about this soil scientist at Iowa State University, who was documenting these incredible amounts of erosion that were happening. And the driver of the erosion was that because fields in the area were essentially bare, they weren't covered by anything because they grow two crops, essentially corn and soybeans. They harvest them at the same time, and there's this long period of multiple months in between the harvest and the next season's planting when the ground is essentially bare. And because it was bare, these giant gullies were forming, these ephemeral gullies that were carrying away tons of topsoil. According to his calculations, the erosion rates were way higher than what the USDA was counting. And so I'm thinking to myself, these are the two main nodes of food production, and they're both in serious ecological crises. And if you look into the California situation, the problems went way deeper than one drought. They were drawing down groundwater at an unsustainable rate for decades. And the situation in the Corn Belt, this is a really bad spring, but it was a trend that had been going on also for decades. And I'm thinking, when you go into a grocery store almost anywhere in the country in the off season, and oftentimes during the growing season, most of what you're going to find is fruits and vegetables from California. That's changed a little bit at the margins, but it's still true. And if you go into the meat case, if the meat wasn't grown in the Midwest, if it was, on factory farms in the Midwest, the factory farms where it was grown were fed by corn and soybeans grown in the Midwest. And so this is sort of like the American dinner plate. It's got fruits and vegetables to one side and a piece of meat in the center. And I'm seeing it kind of in the state of crisis. And so, that's really why I focus on those two areas. But one thing I have to say is there are other areas where industrial ag has touched in the United States. There's Eastern North Carolina, hog, and increasingly now poultry country. There is, I noticed that Food and Water Watch Oregon was really, thankfully, I thank them for promoting this event. Massive dairies in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest. And all these regions, and there are many more of them in the United States, there's sort of tomato country, industrial tomato country in Immokalee, Florida. The same things that I uncover in the book apply to those areas where industrial agriculture touches, where it sort of gets a grip on landscapes, water and soil are abused, and the people who live in those areas find themselves increasingly living in essentially sacrifice zones, and oftentimes they're the very workers that keep the system going. And so because California and the Corn Belt were the two most extreme examples and the two most important examples in terms of the amount that they contribute to the food system, that's why I focus my book on this too.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful, I think, characterization for folks of the broad swaths of what's going on, but also it just strikes me as you're talking, and as I was reading the book, I was reminded of the nexus between food, water, and energy, and all of the interplay of both policy that got kind of this. We talk a lot about consolidation and policy around how these things happen, but your book really goes into also just the landscapes that have been taken advantage of, some of these natural resources that have been diverted. And, we recently released a report on the Colorado River and those water resources that are going into mega dairies and alfalfa. And you mentioned all the different campaigns that we have. With Oregon, we also have a campaign in New Mexico working on the mega dairy crisis there. And so there's so many. It reminded me of why I do this work, but also is really a wonderful way to also just paint the ecology of what's happening. And I think it's really helpful to share that with folks. I know you also have a very personal experience with food and farming, though. And one of the big premises of the book is you talk about, and I actually also had worked on a farm as part of my early career. And so when you paint the picture of the beautiful lettuce and the perfect moment to harvest and how delicious that lettuce is, it really struck me the way that you opened the book. So you have your own experience with farming, with consolidation, and even with feeling the impact of these huge industrial operations really cropping up, particularly in California. Can you talk about the pressure to get big, get out, as we hear from federal policy, or even just the pressure of that kind of burgeoning huge market?
Yeah, so I was part of a small farm in Western North Carolina, and this is a farm. We were the second generation to run it, and it had focused on quality. That was the focus of the farm. We were going to do really small amounts of high quality produce, and the previous generation had sold that to kind of restaurants. It was sort of this restaurant run business, and it had our previous farmer had relationships with restaurants. And we took over the business, and we took over the operation and continue that. And we're also doing stuff like CSA and farmers markets and doing activism in the community to sort of create a more open food system. This is an area in North Carolina there's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of poverty. It's a very touristy area, like so many touristy areas in the United States, where they're essentially two economies. And we were trying to, be part of something that was creating a more open food economy that, increased access to this kind of food. And so the restaurant part of the business was an important part of that. Like, you can sell for a pretty good price to chefs that really appreciate the quality. And that had been going on for years and years. And there was this point, probably 2005, something like that, where this very loyal customer chef let me know that he suddenly had access to organic produce, from organic salad greens specifically from California, at a price significantly lower than what he was paying us. And he would love to buy our stuff if we would accept that price. And for him, he really appreciated our quality, but there was this box he could tick on his menu, I guess, where he could say organic. And he could see a big discount at his, in his costs. And we lost that account and just started seeing that pressure increasingly. And the direction it was taking us was, we're part of this, we're this sort of niche farm that's doing this, we're sort of excluded from the institutional market, the restaurants, the grocery stores, because they're able to get this stuff from California. And there's all these costs that aren't in it. There's like the horrible labor practices that happen on even organic farms in California. There is the overdraw of water. We lived in a very water sort of surplus place, and they're buying their stuff from a very water deficit place, but they're able to, socialize those costs. And so we were, I felt at the time like we were, we could go on in this very niche food system, just, barely scraping by on farmers markets and CSAs, or we could try to expand our business, hire a bunch of people, go into debt, get bigger machines, try to rent more land. And that just seemed like this incredible treadmill. And we, had associates doing it. And it was essentially a get big or get out situation. And it was, it was just really interesting to literally be in Western North Carolina, in this Appalachian region, at the moment that the sort of California behemoth made its presence felt. And I think it was like, there was demand from whoever the supplier was, whoever like the dominant supplier that goes around to all the restaurants was, well, okay, we can get organic salad greens at this price. the chefs will buy it, let's do it. And that really spelled the end of this niche business we had that was so important to this mosaic of income streams that we had. It was this important one being cut off, and it was ended up being a get bigger, get out moment for sure.
Yeah, I'm reminded of also the frame of you talking about the simplification within the book too. So we often talk about, the diversity of our food system and the regionalization of our food system. There are all of these ways in which that we are pushing toward a more sustainable, more resilient, climate resilient, water resilient, also just better food economy. And so I'm reminded of it's not just the get bigger, get out, but here you're being pushed out. And we need to really be looking at policies that also hold on to that middle, not just the farmers markets, but where are those regional producers that are also helping our regional grocery stores and that piece of the middle that is so important for the food system.
Yeah, I mean, just a brief aside, I think that our local food movement, for years and years, the farmers market was so important, and it remains important. It's an incredibly important institution, as are CSAs, but we're almost reaching our limit, and we have to figure out, I mean, if we want to really increase the supply of local and regional food, we have to figure out how we can get it into the institutional setting of, restaurants, schools, like these big institutional buyers that are pumping money into a food economy, but they're pumping money into this California-centric, huge food economy instead of these local food economies. And the hidden subsidies that get those salad greens from California to the East Coast, and also just the labor practices that they're able to get away with, et cetera. All of that is priced in and makes it really, really hard to compete. And so you'll get people saying, we're more than happy to buy your produce, but here's the price you have to take. And so you become a price taker.
Yeah.
And that money flows out of the community and into these bigger institutions.
Right. So right on this same point, but one other aspect of your book, moving from California, going back to the Midwest, to the Corn Belt, you talk about market forces and corn, and how, we've kind of touched on this, but how the corn especially, but how it's not a normal market. So for example, if prices are low, you're going to produce a little bit more to try to make back some and try to break even if you're producing corn. So there's a lot of layers to kind of commodity policy here. But in general, it's not a normal market. So can you talk a little bit about, is there a central force that helps coordinate this? Was there ever, what's the dynamic going on here with why do we have all of this cheap corn in the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, it is this, I think, I feel like federal policy has helped push it in this direction of we're gonna support and reward this couple of crops. And what it comes down to is, you had a period when the US was by far the most important corn and soybean producer in the world. And as I was just looking at the Food and Water Watch's really excellent Farm Bill primer, your Farm Bill, toward a more fair Farm Bill. I'm just paraphrasing the title. And there was a period in U.S. foreign policy when you're sort of Dwight Eisenhower, his secretary Ezra Taft Benson, is that his name? Was pushing. And then later, Earl Buzz picked up this mantra of, don't worry about the surplus, we'll export it. This idea that we'll just dump it into foreign markets, and we'll call it development. And so that was the policy for a long time. And in a sense, in that kind of world, the U.S. farmers, they're not really competing with other farmers. They're easily able to outcompete other farmers in the world. But since that time, we have seen the rise of these other massive nodes of industrial corn and soybean production. They basically figured out that this, the savanna of Brazil, which the colonizers had, the colonizers had seen as this bad land and didn't pay much attention to. In the 20th century, Norman Borlaug himself was part of a team that figured out that if you put lime onto this onto these fields, you could get incredible yields of soybeans. And so we've seen the vast destruction of the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado, and it turned into this this massive area of first soybeans and now corn. Now it's a huge corn producer. Similarly, the Argentine pampas, which are these incredible grasslands, really similar to the U.S. Corn Belt, that supported this incredible grass-based beef agriculture forever and ever. They're converting that into corn and soybeans. The black lands of the Black Earth territory of Ukraine, until a couple of years ago, before this awful war started, that was in the process of being turned into another node of industrial corn and soybean production. And so what you get is U.S. farmers are producing as much corn and soybeans as possible, as our farmers in Brazil, as our farmers in Ukraine, as our farmers in Argentina. And so the price is stagnant. You get, periods where it gets high for some reason, but the input prices quickly come up to meet that. Your seed suppliers, your pesticide suppliers, which are the same, fertilizer suppliers, they come in and raise their prices, and you get this treadmill effect where the net profitability over time is essentially zero because there's so much competition. And that's where we are now. We're in this this treadmill effect, and what keeps it all humming in the U.S. context is basically the Farm Bill, the programs, the commodity program and the crop insurance program and the Farm Bill are what keep it humming. And then meanwhile, the soil erosion rates, the pollution of water. Talk to anyone in Iowa about the quality of water in Iowa, not just nitrates in drinking water, but like algae blooms in lakes and things like that. And it is a full-on catastrophe. And so that's kind of where we are. And, of course, well, who has an interest in it? Well, it's the companies that sell the inputs are making massive profits off of it. They are sort of the suppliers of, shovels and buckets in a gold rush, the ones that actually make money off of it. The great gold rush of Brazil and the great gold rush of corn and soybeans in the last 50 years has not done farmers very much good, except for pushing up land prices. And that's kind of a whole different story, but we have seen this incredible explosion in property values in the Corn Belt. That's really been the only compensation. If you can hang on to your land by the skin of your teeth, then you're going to see this big paper gain in wealth. But that's just sort of a side note.
Right. And also just like a part of the moment in time, as you talk about both ecologically, but from a policy perspective. I mentioned at the beginning of the call that we had that series with folks over the summer. We went into conservation, we went into competition, and then we went into commodities. We didn't do credit, which I know you have a lot of experience with as well, but we just kind of went into the one piece on commodities and where we started with Farm Bill policy of having some management around prices and reserves and a lot of those pieces, and then kind of where we are now. But there's so much policy that does exist that we've actually seen, maybe onto a brighter note, a little bit of a brighter note, that we've seen work decently well in the past, and it needs to be updated to be more equitable, and credit needs to be reformed as well. There are a lot of pieces there, but it just kind of got me thinking about all those different it's not only, it's like beyond the trade as well. So we're using trade instead of domestic policy, and then we're often getting prices below the cost of production and having all of these, ecological effects. So I think you painted just a really helpful picture in the book, and I was, learning it from a new perspective as I was reading it. Speaking of, as I was reading it, there were some really bright spots of stories of folks, bucking the trend, trying to cut out from, having to produce this way, being stuck on that treadmill, as you mentioned. Can you, share either one of those story of one of those examples of bucking that trend, either with, I remember the example of the cover crops, or just talk about, why, if not an example, why it needs to go a bit beyond personal choice and beyond that kind of farmers market approach to policy. And then we can maybe get into some Farm Bill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's one farmer I talked to in the book that I think is an interesting example, and that's this guy, Tom Philpott, up in northern Iowa. And he's actually, he's an organic farmer, but he farms corn, soybeans, and rye. And if you ever get a chance to talk to him or actually have him present in a presentation like this, he will proselytize winter rye as a crop that everyone should be thinking about. And I think he's right. And it's interesting because I visited him in 2019, and any listeners in the Corn Belt will remember and I write about it a lot in the book, the notorious year of 2019, when it started raining in something like February and essentially didn't stop. And it just made this tremendous mess on these bare fields that I'm talking about. And the ephemeral gullies were back with a vengeance. There were, just unspeakable erosion. And Tom Franzen's right in the middle of it. Driving to his place from Ames, you just see, off the side of the road, just these ditches and muddy ditches full of soil, and then just these gashes in the land. And when I went to see him, it was the end of his workday, and he was just screaming about it. He was, telling me where I had to go look at just these awful gullies. And then, he gets me on his 3-wheeler and we go speeding off, and I'm just, hanging on for dear life. I think the sun was setting and he wanted to, get me out there before while it was still light. We go to this field, and it was his winter rye that he was really excited about. And it was just like, I had just seen brown, just really ugly land all day, and just that gray that, is just eroded soil. Mm-hmm. And then here I was in the sea of green, and there are birds flying around. His point was that if you take a third of your land and put it in a crop that's not corn and soybeans, it's not harvested at the same time, that covers the ground in the winter. It doesn't even have to be a cover crop. It could be a cash crop, and you can till it. I mean, you can harvest it in early summer and then plant something else. You can plant a summer cover crop just to keep the ground covered, and then you have this incredible crop that is. It's great animal feed. He showed me his hogs that he was feeding it. He was feeding his he had also had cattle that he was feeding it as well. And it was his farm was like this living ecosystem amid just this ecological squalor. And he just wanted everyone else to do it. And he's organic, so he's getting a premium on his crops. He was I believe involved with Organic Valley, selling his beef to Organic Valley. I think maybe his pork as well. I think they do beef and pork in addition to dairy. And he's getting a little bit of a premium, but he's going really far beyond and experimenting and doing these things. And the market, there's no incentives for it. He's doing it because he wants to take care of his land. And I think that is going to be why he's the exception. He's like the madman over there who's doing this stuff. And, these farmers that have been through this period of, multiple months of straight rain, they're, scrambling to get their crop in. They're in awful shape, but they also know that insurance is going to take care of them, that any losses that they have will be taken care of by insurance. And that really takes incentive away from them to go and do what Tom is doing. And so, I think it's an illustration of how you can have a very ecologically robust system of growing food in that region, but you can't do it just growing 2 crops and then having these giant factory, animal farms that you're, shoving the corn and soybean in and getting pork out of, and just taking all the nitrogen and phosphorus from these crops, running it through the bodies of these animals, and concentrating it into these fields. And you're way over applying the manure, and you've got all this excess nitrogen and phosphorus going into streams and causing all this pollution. is utterly insane, but it's propped, there's no incentive to change. And you've got these farmers that are on this treadmill that, the mentality is that what I'm losing on price, I'll make up for, I'll make it up in volume, but everyone has that same idea. And so no one makes it up in volume. And, we get this, net long-term, they've competed away. There's hyper competition between farmers and no competition between these companies. And the farmers have no collective power to negotiate on prices. And so it's just an utterly disastrous situation.
Right. And we get that also with contract agriculture, which, as folks probably know, is largely hog and chicken at this point, but not even being able to compete on an open market, but having to be tied to contracts from these integrators. We've just really, really pushed our policy in this direction that is truly get big or get out. And now this is, what we have. Maybe again, going toward a hopefully more positive farm bill year. It's going to be a tough year. Maybe let's transition into thinking about that a little bit. As I mentioned in the beginning of the call, September 30th is the end of the 2018 Farm Bill. We are in a bit of a stalled process. We're still waiting to pass the appropriations bills in both the House and the Senate, which, as folks probably know, is basically our yearly budget, federal government, and the Farm Bill is every 5 years. So we've had, hearings all throughout this year. We've had hearings in places, in regions across the country where community members, farmers, folks are showing up and talking about these issues. What are you thinking about for this Farm Bill, for the steadily approaching deadline? You painted a really beautiful picture with all of these different examples, and trying to encourage folks they should really read your book because you really, really paint an understanding of what's going on. So what are you thinking about as we're heading toward that deadline?
Yeah, I feel like the politics are pretty dire. So what we have is the situation, as in the House, we've got this Freedom Caucus, this group, this sort of loose band of very sort of right-wing House reps, and really they kind of have managed really since 2013 when they were kind of more known as the Tea Party, but it's really sort of an evolution of the same thing. They've really thrown a wrench or dropped a bomb into the old nutrition titles versus commodity titles. There are parts of Congress that support nutrition titles. There are parts of Congress that support the commodity titles. By pushing them together in the Farm Bill, they sort of scratch each other's backs and you come up with a bill. Well, this Freedom Caucus, they don't care if they both end. They really want to kick poor people. That is something that they take a special delight in. And so they really have it in for SNAP, which is this, 80 or 85% of the Farm Bill. But they also don't care about a safety net for farmers. And so they're willing to sacrifice that as well. And so they really have the House they put the House in a very difficult position. I think G.T. Thompson, the House Ag Chair, and Speaker McCarthy would like to see a normal Farm Bill passed, but ain't no way that's going to happen with this Freedom Caucus. It isn't number one on their agenda right now. They want to impeach Biden, but it's high up there. They want to cause trouble with the Farm Bill. They don't have the leverage to take it very far. It's not going to fly in the Senate. Biden wouldn't sign it. So what we have is just a big mess that's probably going to, I think, play out over multiple months and go into go into next year's election year. And then you've got, the forces of industrial agriculture are gathering to try to get the commodity titles to be sweeter, to increase insurance. There was just a report put out by the, I think it was the House Ag Committee, the GOP House Ag Committee folks were putting a thing out saying farm incomes are going down. It's time to, basically make the system that I talked about just now, more generous and sort of put more weight behind the status quo. And I think that, the battles that we're going to see ahead are, fighting back these attacks on SNAP and sorting that out. And then there is also the money for conservation that was put in by the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are Republicans, it's baked into the baseline of the Farm Bill, but there are Republicans that want to get into that money and do something else with it. And, Stabenow in the Senate has said that's not going to fly. So these are the sort of battles that we're going to be seeing play out. But unfortunately, some of the great stuff, like what you guys have in the Food and Water Watch Farm Bill primer, like one I think that we should talk about, just, we've just been through, just had this, this awful war in Ukraine. We've got this, just the Black Sea embargoes happening, the flow of wheat from the Black Sea, gotten really complicated, if not halted. And what that's done to global commodity prices, it's put upward pressure on global commodity prices. In America, we don't see it as much because most of that stuff goes into the feed market. So maybe the price of meat goes up a little bit, but people aren't literally living on corn and soybeans and wheat very much. But when that stuff goes up in the global South, you get real hunger crises. And there's a lot of people in Northern Africa and other parts of the global South who really rely on wheat. And obviously when one of the great wheat regions of the world goes into a war situation, you get a spike in the wheat price. And all this what I'm getting at is how we need grain reserves. It is insane in a period of climate sort of volatility, recurring droughts and floods in key growing regions, and now literal war happening in a key growing region. It is insane that the US basically sold off its grain reserves, and not only did that, but used policy, used its power in organizations like the IMF to force or convince other countries to sell off their grain reserves as well. It is now is an obvious time, as soon as prices come down, these things are cyclical. We need to be building up stocks of grain, and it's got to be done in a way where it's publicly and democratically controlled. And so there's not some grain baron who's got a bunch of grain who can, exert power in the market, but democratically run grain reserves. And the place to start it is right here in the United States. The ones that told everyone else not to do it, with climate chaos happening. My book goes into a lot into how climate chaos, how fragile the system is, incredibly productive and also incredibly fragile. And I did a column on this for Mother Jones just last year. It is time to bring back grain reserves. And I wish I could say, hey, this is a big thing in the Farm Bill debate. There's a big constituency behind it, and but I don't think anyone's talking about it, but, except for a few groups like Food and Water Watch and a few, scattered journalists like me. But yeah, everyone on this call, think about grain reserves. Let's all rally behind them. It was a big part of foreign policy until in the old New Deal foreign policies that, started to be dismantled as early as the 60s.
Yeah.
But
no, you're making my job easier for me. Thank you. Exactly. We talk often about grain reserves, supply management ideas, price floors, things to, Tom talked a lot about volatility, both ecologically, but in markets. And the way to make these things fair is to, reform that volatility. So we talk about that all the time when we're chatting with our friends on the Hill, with our farm friends. And the point that I come back to is we don't have legislation or language that we're really pushing right now. It's a huge part of the conversation for folks like us, of course, because we point back to it. But I think, again, going back to a positive point is, and with some of these other conservation programs too, like EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the original intent of that program, the original intent of the Farm Bill, awesome. It was designed to rein in some of this volatility, not perfect by any means, but rein in some of this volatility and make food and farming fair. the first Farm Bill came out of, the Dust Bowl, and we're talking about they're in ecological crisis. So I think just, the timing and what we've seen in the past, really instructive of where we need to go in the future. And I think we're coming close to wanting to do audience questions, but is there anything more about the Farm Bill cycle kind of relative to all of your research and the writing of your stories that you've done in your book that you'd want to mention before we move to that?
Well, just that a lot of sort of gnarled veterans like myself, and there are way even more, people not even as old as I am, but who've been at it longer than I have in these trenches. And there is this this exhaustion that comes with these 5-year cycles where, we do all this education, we do all this writing, we do all these primers, and then the same damn thing happens. But what I want to say right now is that change takes a long time, and change in this country requires social movements. And that, basically the force that props up the status quo is the lobbying power of these corporations that dominate so much of the food system. And you can look in past Food and Water Watch reports that document the sort of lobbying power and campaign finance power of the big meat companies, of the big pesticide/seed companies. You guys have done wonderful material on that over the years. I've written about it a bunch over the years. I write about it in Perilous Bounty. And in our political system, they have this, essentially monopoly position, and they reap monopoly profits, and they invest very rationally and smartly a portion of that profit into maintaining the status quo. And the only thing that we have at our disposal is people power, social movements. And, voting with your fork is really important. I bet everyone on this call does it, but it's not enough. We have to get political about food. And I actually, when I think about like hope for the next Farm Bill, and I actually, I am not the most positive Pete about the current Farm Bill, but the next Farm Bill I have hope for. And I think about how someone like Greg Casar, who is a newly elected representative out of Texas, my old district of Austin, Texas, is on the Ag Committee. Cory Booker, in my career, close to 20 years on this beat, I have not seen a politician on the Ag Committee with his progressive ideas and his openness to ideas. And there's that quote from Milton Friedman that Naomi Klein talks about in her book Shock Doctrine, that when there's a crisis, it's the ideas that are lying around that can there's this chaos from a crisis, and these ideas can lead to change. And I think that Food and Water Watch is building the sort of generating those ideas. And when there is a moment of change, maybe we get a better Congress next time, a better, a good solid president, and a Congress behind that person. The time will come for change, and that will happen with electing politicians like Greg Casar, and who are open to new ideas, and just sort of being the countervailing force that pushes back against this big powerful lobby. And it requires immense patience. None of this happens overnight. It doesn't happen in a decade or even 2 decades, but we're well into the struggle here. And we just have to keep that in mind, that it really always is. And that this Farm Bill is important, but the next Farm Bill is always the really important one.
Keep going, eyes on the prize. I think that I perfectly, encapsulates, I'm thinking about why we also take our organizing work so seriously, is because we know we're building toward, we have state-based campaigners who are working on moratoria and different biogas and factory farm campaigns in state, but also similarly working with senators like Senator Cory Booker, Representative Ro Khanna for the Farm System Reform Act. It's this big bill that we need a moratorium on factory farms, but we also need all of these reforms that come along with it to make it more fair and resilient. And it's not going to pass tomorrow, but it's the thing that we keep getting up and doing, organizing around, and bringing folks like the folks who are on this call to join into that, and to join into things like our Fair Farm Bill team, who've also been at it for this Farm Bill season, even though it's been a tough one, and we know it's going to be an uphill battle. But it's good to have the policies on our side and have the wonderful research on our side as well from folks like you. So I think Kate is going to jump in here. I know we have so many questions and we're getting toward time, but thank you for that wonderful discussion and for talking both about the book and food policy, but also Farm Bill. So I'll pass to Kate.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. This has been such a lively discussion. People are really appreciating all of your insights. So we've got a lot of audience questions. We'll get through maybe one or two before we have to close out here. So the first one, I'm going to kind of combine a couple questions from people. There was a lot of consensus, it resonated with a lot of people, what you were saying about the need for more diverse and regional food hubs, so that we get away from sort of this, all of our fruits and vegetables come from California, all of our meat comes from Iowa. So people are asking, what policies or incentives do you think we need to see to make that transition happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think our policymakers have to come to the realization that we have to get away from relying on, just to get back to fruits and vegetables, get away from relying on California so much. We've seen, crushing droughts. And, I think that it's starting to get to the point where, are they even droughts anymore? Or are they this new normal? There's this, crazy pattern of California weather where you get, essentially years of very little precipitation in the winter, which is when they get their precipitation. And then these years like this past winter of just, unimaginable deluges, like huge amounts of deluges. And so you're on this knife's edge between drought and catastrophic flooding. And if you read one thing in my book, read chapter 2, which you can find actually for free on Mother Jones. They published an excerpt from it. And we almost, we once again saw the possibility for catastrophic flooding there this year. And what we saw this year was a fraction of what could come. And so this is not a great place to, hang your fruit and vegetable habit on. And so I think if, basically what, different regions of the country need to get together and decide, how can we maximize fruit and vegetable? So every different region of the country has different ecological assets. They've got weather, they've got soil patterns. To do a real inventory of that, and what would it take, and also land use policy, what would it take to get farmers, small and mid-sized farmers, back on the land, and what kind of market development do they need? What kind of infrastructure do they need? And I think we need to have a big national conversation about that. And it should be regional. It shouldn't be, like hyper local. It should be the Northeast region coming together. States that have, a similar sort of ecosystem, and a shared ecosystem should come together, inventory their ecological assets, and figure out how they can maximize food production. And that way, California is not going to go away. It's not going to like wash off the map or dry away and never produce food anymore. It's just going to be less reliable for it. And so, let's build some redundancy into the food system. Let's have multiple sources. And, we also saw during COVID, just the need for, we have very efficient supply chains. Well, let's add some redundancy. Let's add some robustness to the supply chains. And so I think it's a regional problem that something like the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as it's known, could spearhead this effort, in a lot more of a focused way. And something like the Farm Bill, we should step back from it. It's national farm policy that's being made every 5 years that has been set into these patterns. But there could be discussion in the Farm Bill, how do we re-regionalize fruit and vegetable production? What resources could go into it? What kind of money could we put behind it? And it's going to be different answers for different areas and places like, in the Corn Belt. I think the answer is going to be season extension infrastructure, also marketing infrastructure. There's a section in my book when I sort of calculate the number of acres it would take to make the Corn Belt self-sufficient in a bunch of fruits and vegetables throughout the growing season. And it's essentially a few counties in Iowa. Now, of course, it would be dispersed. It wouldn't just be those few counties, but the amount of land is it's a few 100,000 acres. And so to figure out how to make that happen, how to make, why is Chicago getting its fruits and vegetables from California in the summer when there's this incredible farmland all around it, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think it's a question of policy, and it's a question of deciding as a society that this is what we want to do. And the work that's happened, this is really important, over the past 30 years to develop local regional food systems has been extremely grassroots. I was part of it when I was doing that farm for a while. And it's an incredible asset to build upon. The farmers markets, the CSAs, the people in the trenches doing that work, building on that. And, just one more thing, and that is, we have had this incredible dispossession of African-American farmland over the past century. And one way, so we have, and I've written about this, there's this movement of young Black farmers. There's this problem of farmland being so expensive and farmland near cities being really expensive, but some kind of land distribution policy and, land reform in the United States, killing two birds with one stone, getting people back on farms into a regionalized food system would be a wonderful use of federal policy. I know it's a really complicated and rambling answer, but that's what I got for you.
I think that's all great. I would add the Justice for Black Farmers Act is a bill that has been introduced in this Congress as part of let's consider it for the Farm Bill, also Senator Cory Booker, and it deals with some of those historic wrongs of USDA. The other, I think, nice piece of what's happening right now in U.S. policy, again, going for the positive notes, President Joe Biden's executive order on competition, part of that was regional processing, small regional processing facilities, which, as we know, is part of the hyper consolidated meat market. It's really hard if you want to raise small scale pasture based to actually get animals processed. And so while we want to see all of those things, we also at Food and Water Watch talk about the other side of that is, okay, is the market fair that we're entering those things into? Are we enforcing
Absolutely.
our antitrust laws, Packers and Stackyards Act, all of that historic, we need that fairness for those values to actually be able to survive and thrive in markets, which I think, again, you bring together all of those pieces in your work.
A huge part of the puzzle, for sure, is reining back the power of those companies.
Yeah.
I'm going to sneak in one last question
No,
before
we're
we're
running.
to wrap here. So this one's from McKaylin, and she's asking, are there tactics or actions you have seen movements use to limit the power of big ag and impact their bottom line, and just sort of disrupt their influence over the political class?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think, some of the answers lie in communities that are really at the cutting edge, really at the bleeding edge of this kind of stuff. Like people in North Carolina, in Eastern North Carolina, largely African-American areas, where the industry has decided to cite its giant hog CAFOs. There's been incredible social movement pushback there. I think, and including launching nuisance lawsuits. I mean, these companies are so powerful that that they're able to, they have so much influence in a state like North Carolina itself that they've been able to limit the impact of these. But launching lawsuits, going to the courts and saying you are trampling on our rights because you are literally destroying our quality of life. I think that movement, I think one very vulnerable spot that we saw also exposed in the pandemic is the, essentially ritual sacrifice of the bodies of meatpacking workers that, we saw with the way that their employers, these giant meat companies, failed to protect them from the COVID virus. But it also, the reason why that they were exposed, these workers were so exposed to the COVID virus was because, OSHA has done a really horrible job of, enforcing worker safety rules where you get, extremely common repetitive stress injuries in these meatpacking plants and workers movements. There's this group in poultry country in Arkansas called Venceremos that is organizing poultry workers. There is the Coalition of Immokalee workers down in Florida who have organized in a right to work state where it's really hard to form a proper union. They've organized in this non-union way, organized farm workers there and taken on the growers by attacking their markets and targeting the companies that they sell to. I think these are extremely effective tactics. I did a piece, I believe it was last year, on Venceremos and its organizing in Arkansas and how they're learning from the Coalition of Immokalee workers and how to bring that kind of pressure onto big poultry companies. And if you Google my name and the Coalition of Immokalee workers, hopefully it'll come up. Although Google is broken now, another example of hyper consolidation. It's really hard to find stuff on Google now, but I think you'll probably find it like the 10th search down. And so those are just a couple of examples. And I'm, obviously moving real fast here, but, that kind of thing, or, organizing people who are most affected by this stuff is extremely important and extremely effective, I think.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just found that article that you mentioned and dropped that in the chat for everybody. So we unfortunately are at time here, so I do have to wrap us up on Q&A, but I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight, for sending in all these great questions, being part of this conversation. And thank you so much, Tom, for joining us and sharing all of your expertise on this. I do just want to reshare the title of Tom's book. It's called Perilous Bounty: The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. Yeah, Rebecca and I both have our copies here. We highly recommend you check it out and read it. It's just a fascinating look at our food and farm policy and the challenges we face. And there's just also some great examples in there of people who are really challenging that status quo. So make sure you all check it out. I have a couple final quick reminders before I close this all out. So let me just go ahead and share my screen again with you all real quick. Great. So yeah, as I mentioned at the start, if you are not a Food and Water Watch member, I invite you to join us as a member today. We don't take any corporate funding, but as you've been hearing, that's exactly who we're taking on. We are going up against an entrenched agricultural industry with a lot of money, but we are fighting to challenge that status quo by pushing for policies that put more profit directly in the hands of independent farmers who are growing our food in a sustainable way that's good for the environment. And as we've heard from Tom and Rebecca, these are long-term fights. They're multi-year fights at the state and federal level. So your support really does go a long way in building our organizing capacity and the grassroots power that will get us there. So if you're able to, we'll put the link in the chat one more time where you can make a gift and become a Food and Water Watch member today. And I invite you to join us at some of our other upcoming Livable Future live events happening over the next few months. We'll be discussing keeping PFAS chemicals out of our water. And at the end of the year, we'll be talking about our state of the climate to review some lessons learned as we head into the new year. And finally, I invite you to join us next month on October 11th and 12th for our Against All Odds annual benefit. You can take part in the virtual conference where we'll have Jane Fonda as our keynote. Or if you're in New York City, I'd love to see you in person at our reception. And don't forget that we do have a special registration code that you can use as a thank you for joining us today. We'll drop that in the chat for you one more time. And I know there was a lot of conversation and links that were shared today in the chat, so don't worry if you don't have those all saved. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with a recording of tonight's discussion, as well as some of the comments and links that were shared in the chat. So please feel free to share all those resources with friends, family, colleagues, and invite others to get involved in these efforts. And lastly, in about an hour, you'll get an automated email or text message asking you to submit feedback about today's event. Please go ahead and leave a comment for us. We love hearing your thoughts on our monthly discussions. And that's all from us. Just want to thank you all again so much for joining us for our Livable Future Live event series. I hope everyone has a great evening, and we'll see you at the next event. Thanks.